There's one thing in the entire universe you can be absolutely certain exists. And yet, it's also the single greatest mystery in all of science. It's that light inside your head, right? The actual feeling of being alive. So with all that in mind, after thousands of years of people debating this, have we gotten any closer to an answer? What is consciousness?
It seems like such a simple question, doesn't it? But man, it has stumped the smartest people for millennia. We can try to define it with words, but then you have to define those words, and on it goes. So to really get a handle on it, we usually have to start with some analogies.
When you try to picture it, two images usually pop up. Is your consciousness like a spotlight? Picking out one little thought at a time from this vast, dark warehouse of your mind? Or is it more like a stream, just a continuous, unbroken flow of thoughts, feelings, and sensations? Both of those metaphors, they feel kind of right, but they only describe what it's like. They don't get us to the real heart of the mystery.
Because the ultimate mystery isn't just about what consciousness does, it's about why it even exists in the first place. To really tackle this, scientists realized they first had to separate what they call the easy problems from the one truly hard one.
Now, let's be clear. Calling them easy is a bit of a joke. These things are incredibly complex, but they're problems that science can, at least in principle, solve, right? We can map the neural circuits for attention, we can build models for how memory works, we can trace all the pathways that control our behavior, we can pretty much explain what the brain does. But here's the thing. Explaining what the brain does, that doesn't tell us why it feels like anything to be a brain. Why isn't all of that complicated processing just happening in the dark, like a computer, with no inner experience at all? Why does seeing the color red feel like red? That is the core of the problem.
Okay, so this huge challenge, it actually has a name. Philosopher David Chalmers famously called it the hard problem of consciousness. And it's all about that gap, that huge, unbridgeable canyon between the physical world of, neurons firing and electricity buzzing around, and your private internal world of actual experience. Philosophers have a fancy word for this stuff, qualia. But really, it just boils down to this. How does a 3-pound lump of matter create the very real, subjective taste of chocolate? So how in the world do you even begin to try and solve this impossible problem? Well, thinkers tend to fall into a few major camps. The first one, and probably the most common view in science today, is materialism. This idea that the physical brain literally builds the mind.
One of the big theories here is called the global workspace theory. The best way to think about it is with a theater metaphor. So imagine your brain has this huge, unconscious audience, all these specialized little processors, each doing its own job, language, emotion, you name it. Then, attention acts like a spotlight. It picks one specific piece of information and shines a light on it, putting it up there on a global stage. And it's only when that information is broadcast widely to the entire audience that it becomes conscious.
There's a related idea from neuroscientist Michael Graziano called attention schema theory. It suggests that consciousness isn't some magical extra property at all. He argues it's just the brain's simplified model of its own process of attention. So in other words, that feeling of awareness you have, it's just a self-representation, a useful but kind of cartoonish sketch of a much more complicated process happening under the hood.
Then you've got computational theorist Joshua Bach, who takes this even further. He says, okay, part of your brain, probably the prefrontal cortex, acts like a conductor for an orchestra. It creates this compressed summary, a protocol of all the brain's activity. But here's the real twist. What you feel as conscious experience, well, it isn't actually happening in real time. It's your brain accessing the memory of that summary. The feeling is the information. There's no separate feeling thing happening on the side.
And yet, this just brings us right back to the hard problem, doesn't it? I mean, even if these models are totally correct, they're describing a mechanism. They're explaining a flow of information. But they still don't tell us how broadcasting a signal or creating a self-model or accessing a memory magically generates the subjective feeling of anything at all. This deep, deep challenge has led another camp to a pretty radical conclusion. They look at this whole mess and ask, what if we have the entire relationship between mind and matter completely backwards? Seriously, what if the brain isn't some kind of magical consciousness-creating machine? What if, instead, consciousness is the fundamental stuff of the universe, and the brain is just something that appears within it?
All right, so let's put these two camps side by side, because they're polar opposites. For Camp 1, the materialists, everything starts with matter and energy. The physical world is the foundation, and mind, well, mind somehow pops out of it. It's an emergent thing. But for Camp 2, the idealists and panpsychists, they flip the script entirely. They say consciousness is the foundation. It's the fundamental reality. The brain, then, isn't the source of consciousness. It's just what consciousness looks like from our particular point of view. And if you start there, you see how the hard problem just kind of vanishes, right? You don't have to explain how consciousness arises from matter if it was there to begin with.
And believe me, this camp has some pretty wild ideas. You've got analytic idealism, which proposes that you and I, we're all just dissociated fragments of one single universal mind. Then there's conscious realism, which says our entire reality, space and time included, is just a user interface, like the icons on your computer desktop, hiding a much deeper reality. And then there's panpsychism, the idea that maybe even a single electron has a tiny, rudimentary flicker of experience.
But this camp has its own hard problem. It's often called the combination problem. Okay, so let's say an electron has a little bit of consciousness. How do trillions upon trillions of them combine all their little micro experiences into one rich, seamless, unified consciousness like the one you're using to understand me right now?
So if the brain creating the mind is a huge problem, and the mind creating the world is also a huge challenge, there's a third group of thinkers who suggest we're just asking the wrong question entirely. Maybe consciousness isn't a thing at all.
This view says we're just framing the whole question wrong from the start. What if consciousness isn't a noun but a verb? It's not a thing you have, like a rock in your head. It's a process that you're doing, like a wave moving through the ocean. It's this dynamic, ever-changing state of becoming. This isn't a new idea, really. Buddhist philosophy has been arguing this for centuries, saying that consciousness is just this interdependent flow, and that our idea of a solid, permanent self is actually an illusion. You also have philosophers like Heidegger, who described consciousness as an active being in the world, totally inseparable from its environment. Or Alfred North Whitehead, who saw all of reality as being made of occasions of experience, a constant process of feeling and becoming.
So where does all this leave us? We've got three totally different ways of looking at this. Consciousness from matter, matter from consciousness, and consciousness as a process. And yet across all of them, there's this one deeply unsettling idea that just keeps popping up. It's the idea that your persistent sense of self, that I that feels like it's been with you your whole life, the little pilot sitting in your skull, is not what it seems. That it's a construct, a useful story, a fiction, a model that's created by the very processes it claims to be observing. And that leads us to the final, really dizzying paradox of it all. If the self is just a story the brain is telling itself, a character in a neurological play, then who or what is in the audience? Who is listening?